Good afternoon. I'm Dory Mitros-Durham, and on behalf of the Clow Center for Civil and Human Rights in the Keough School of Global Affairs, I'm delighted to welcome you to our lecture series, Building an Anti-Racist Vocabulary. This series is open to all members of the Notre Dame community, current students, staff, faculty, and alumni, and people are tuning in now from all over the country and the world to listen and learn with their Notre Dame family. Our warmest welcome to all of you. Each Friday this academic year, the Clow Center will bring you a preeminent author, scholar, or public intellectual, and together, prompted by questions from our students, we will break down one racial justice topic at a time. This week, our anti-racist word of the week is Tulsa. Before I introduce our expert this week, I'd like to tell you a story that will form the backdrop of our conversation today. It was Memorial Day in 1921, almost exactly 100 years ago. Dick Rowland, a Black 19-year-old who worked as a shoe shiner, went into the Drexel building in Tulsa, Oklahoma to use a segregated restroom, the only restroom nearby Dick's place of work that he was permitted to use. Moments later, Sarah Page, the 17-year-old white teenager who worked as the building's elevator operator, cried out, and Dick was seen fleeing. What exactly transpired in those moments was never known, but it is widely believed that Dick had tripped and grabbed Sarah's arm to steady himself. A white clerk from a neighboring store heard her cry and ran to Sarah, and seeing her distraught, called the police and reported an assault. The next morning, Dick was apprehended. Sarah said only that he had grabbed her arm and declined to press charges, but the damage had been done. The Tulsa Tribune, a white paper with a fiery owner who cared for sensational headlines, carried inflammatory news of the accusation and the arrest on Tuesday in its afternoon edition. As rumors spread, a crowd of several hundred white residents of Tulsa gathered outside the jail demanding Rowland be released to them. The new Tulsa sheriff attempted to secure the building and Rowland, determined not to allow a lynching, as had occurred the previous year. As the white crowd swelled, 50 or 60 armed Black men from Tulsa's Black population of 11,000 also arrived at the jail, pledging to secure Dick from the possibility of mob violence. By 10 p.m., the crowd, overwhelmingly white and now armed, had reached 1,000. A struggle ensued when a white man tried to take a Black man's gun. Shots were fired and then counter-fired. And when that brief exchange was over, 10 white men and 2 Black men lay dead. The Black men retreated to the Greenwood neighborhood, called Black Wall Street, for the successful businesses and proper homes it held in over 30 square blocks of segregated property. The white mob followed, shooting Black residents on sight. Some had been deputized by the police and instructed to kill. The mobs dispersed, going house to house, stealing valuables, destroying property, and at times executing residents. A prominent Black doctor was executed with his hands up on his front porch, surrendering to the mob. By 1 a.m., mobs were now setting fire to businesses and homes and turning away the fire department at gunpoint. Multiple eyewitness accounts describe small private planes flying low over Greenwood, firing machine guns into the neighborhood and dropping firebombs. Black Tulsans fought to protect their homes or fled town, but they were outnumbered. Some of the reported death tolls following the massacre suggested only 25 deaths among Greenwood residents, but in a more recent study, the estimates are as high as 300 Black Tulsans murdered on June 1st and 2nd, 1921. Hundreds were wounded and thousands displaced. By late morning the following day, the National Guard had arrived and imposed martial law, ending most of the violence. They arrested 30 or 40 of the survivors and turned over 100 more Black men and women to civil authorities. Nearly 6,000 survivors were placed in an internment camp at the fairgrounds where, to add insult to murder, they were to be allowed to leave only if vouched for by a white Tulsan. Every insurance claim by a Greenwood resident was denied on the basis of a riot exclusion clause, and no convictions were ever obtained for anyone involved in the massacre. Almost immediately, the massacre was hidden from view and not made a part of the required Oklahoma history curriculum until January 2020. Mr. James Goodwin, our guest today, is an attorney and the publisher of the Oklahoma Eagle, the state's only Black newspaper, a role that a member of his family has held for nearly 100 years continuously. Among his accomplishments in his distinguished legal career, in 1969, he successfully defended a Black speaker in a First Amendment case that made its way all the way to the United States Supreme Court. Mr. Goodwin also served as co-counsel in a 2003 suit seeking reparations for victims of the Tulsa Massacre. Mr. Goodwin is a 1961 graduate of the University of Notre Dame in what was then called the General Program, but now the Program of Liberal Studies. Before Mr. Goodwin's remarks, he'd like to share with us a short video from the Oklahoma Eagle on the past and future of Tulsa.
There was a conspiracy of silence for many years. It's only but recent that they're now beginning to include it in the textbooks. At one time, Oklahomans, black Oklahomans, owned over 3 million acres of land in northeastern Oklahoma. And as a result of that, they became wealthy because this was an oil and gas state. Tulsa, Oklahoma was the one place, it was a living testimony or testament against white supremacy. Black Wall Street would never have occurred but for Jim Crow. Jim Crow was designed to subjugate and to keep us in depression. This is a perfect example of jealousy. I mean, there was sheer jealousy. Here, the popular view with many white Americans was a black inferiority. But this was proven, this city proved that to be a massive lie. Black folks are not considered, and we still suffer from this whole idea of racism today, but black folks are not supposed to be intelligent, or we're not supposed to be capable of functioning because of days of slavery. There were about 77,000 population, 13% of which was black. And at the time of the massacre, over 50%, almost 60% of the black community was imprisoned for about eight days in internment camps. But black folks were buried all over this community. I guess a thing that white folks who were racist could not abide, they came in and plundered and destroyed. They killed, stealed, and destroyed an entire community in less than a day. The names and identities of those people who were killed and murdered have not all yet been discovered. The Oakland Eagle has been writing about it for years, and you know, it was interesting. We are the only institutions that still exist after that aftermath were 2 churches and the newspaper. 3 very vital and important institutions in our world today. When they saw what happened to Mr. Floyd, that was simply evil. It was not right. It was wrong, and people understand that. And every time we see a human being abused, and black folks are abused much more often in the criminal justice system, you cannot fight hate with hate. The outrage is certainly understandable, and enough is enough. But you cannot fight hate with hate. It just exacerbates it. We're going to have to find ways to love one another. Yet there's got to be a stopping of this police brutality. And the world is now understanding of the United States. That's why you have this multiracial coming together. But Dr. King reminded us, though, we're going to have to live together as brothers or die as fools. And I think the soul of America really is black folks are brought to attention and brought to the consciousness of the world, their humanity, and I think that will hopefully make America much more righteous when it learns to deal with equality and justice for black Americans.
Mr. Goodwin, welcome back to Notre Dame. The floor is yours. Looks like we may have some technical difficulties. There we are. Mr. Goodwin, you're still muted. There you are.
Am I there now?
There you are. We have you. Fantastic.
Thank you. I want to thank you, and I want to thank our president, Father John Jenkins, and I want to thank Ms. McElroy, for this invitation. But I want to give a special shout out to my college roommate, Dr. Percy Pierre, who, but for him and his introduction of me to Father Jenkins informally, for this opportunity to share with you some of the history of Tulsa, a city that I love and one that I call home. Now you may ask, why is Tulsa the subject of this seminar? Well, as you've indicated, it is a place where Black Americans suffered the biggest and the deadliest racist terrorist attack in US history. On a good note, however, Tulsans have big footsteps on the Notre Dame campus. The names of LaFortune, Siegfried, Biagini, Warren are but a few that come to mind. The history of Greenwood cannot be told without including the history of slavery, the history of Jim Crow, and the history of the 1832 Indian Removal Act and the 1887 Indian Allotment Act. For example, as a result of the Indian Allotment Act, as indicated in the video, Black people owned over 3 million acres of northeastern Oklahoma and established 30 towns, many of them in the 1890s, before Oklahoma's state became, before Oklahoma became a state in 1907. There is so much history yet to be revealed on how the land was taken away from those settlers, but I caution you, don't be under any illusion. Tulsa then as now is but a microcosm and a reflection of the United States at large. Most recently, Tulsa's historic Greenwood district was brought to the national attention by businessman and philanthropist Michael Bloomberg, who announced a $70 million reinvestment in minority enterprises. He called it, I think, the Greenwood Project, to ameliorate conditions across the nation. It was also brought to the nation's attention by President Donald Trump when he came to Tulsa to restart his national campaign. At the same time, the 155th commemoration of Juneteenth was being celebrated. Now, Juneteenth was the time enslaved Black people in Texas first heard they had been freed by President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation 2.5 years after it was signed. Trump's visit brought a renewed attention not only to the race massacre, but his presence also put the spotlight on the painful and frustrating but hopeful efforts to reclaim the vacant land on Greenwood taken by the city of Tulsa more than 4 decades ago. He signed the spotlight is shown on a renewed focus on obtaining reconstruction for the Greenwood's deconstruction, and he brought attention to for further support to the revitalization of Greenwood today against the ever-encroaching gentrification. This occasion to speak at Notre Dame's community, our alumni and friends, provides me an opportunity to share both my and my family's connection to the race massacre before it occurred, during its deadly mayhem, and after its and today's after effects. The reverberations still exist. And before I go further, I want to commend your attention
It's 12 o'clock.
To the Eastern Oklahoma Catholic magazine, which was published this month, in which I wrote a short article about Holy Family Catholic Church's role during the massacre. It's informative and heartfelt, and I encourage you to review it to get some firsthand accounts of that occasion. In 1957, as I was just 17 years old, I arrived at the Notre Dame campus. And at the same time I did so at the same time as 4 other Black freshmen. Percy Pierre was from New Orleans. Ron Gregory was from St. Louis. Edmund Leo Kilawilla was from Tanzania. Gregory, the younger brother of the late comedian and civil rights advocate Dick Gregory, has described our presence on the campus as like being in a bubble. I agree. He said that we were a speck of pepper in a sea of salt. There were only 20 of us out of approximately 5,000 students, 12 undergraduates and 8 graduate students. Again, I agree. He said we were admired like famous Jackie Robinson was admired. Jackie Robinson was the first African American who integrated Major League Baseball just 10 years earlier. We did feel special. We also came to Notre Dame in 1957 at the same time that President Dwight Eisenhower appointed Notre Dame's father, Theodore Hesburgh, to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. Father Hesburgh not only had a profound effect upon me as a person, but also upon this nation in his capacity as a member of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. In 1961, as a condition from graduating from the Notre Dame's general program, I wrote a 77-page senior thesis detailing the disparity in employment between Black and white citizens in Tulsa. I probed why the disparity, and I formulated a plan to cure it. In my first chapter, I dubbed the Tulsa problem. I want to share with you the introduction. In my introduction, I quoted Father Hesburgh, who wrote in the Commission's Civil Rights Report that no American can escape taking a stand on civil rights. No American can really disengage himself from this problem. Each of us must choose to deepen the anguish of the problem by silence and passivity. If nothing more, I must take a forthright stand on principles that give some hope to the eventual solution. To me, his words meant the same now as they did then. One is either a racist or an anti-racist. In that thesis almost 6 years ago, I began chapter 1 as follows. On a hillside several decades ago stood a burning cross. Hundreds of jubilant men, all members of the Ku Klux Klan, had gathered around it. 2 days earlier, they had mercilessly plundered and destroyed 50% of the Negro community. Now they converged upon a burning cross in celebration of victory. Behind them was a trail of blood and $2 million in property damage. The alleged assault of a white girl by a Negro man had been thoroughly avenged. This hillside rendezvous was a tribute to their triumph and expression of their gluttonous success. The burning cross symbolized all their hatred for the Negro and emblematized the white supremacist doctrine. It so controlled them that as the flame grew into one massive blaze, so also the single taunts of hate blended into the thunderous roar of a mob. This hard scene of cross burning could have taken place anywhere in America. The practice was so widespread, and in 1957 is only a little less than common even then. But this particular event occurred in America's most beautiful city, Tulsa, Oklahoma. I went on to say that Tulsans do not relish recollection of their ignoble past. Whites do not, perhaps because of shame. Negroes do not because of the misery they were forced to endure. But of a necessity, the past must be recalled. For how else can be explained the flagrant inequities between white and Negro citizens, which now in 1957 exist in Tulsa, except that they be explained by the still smoldering coals of the cross burn 40 years ago. Now that scene I described most recently and found it necessary to do so in an edition of the Oklahoma Eagle. And I described that scene this way. By 1921, although racially segregated, the people of Greenwood flourished against enormous odds. Suddenly, in the twilight's last gleaming, came thousands of white terrorists, pillaging and utterly destroying it. Their guns slaughtered hundreds of innocents. There were bombs bursting in air, and by the dawn's early light could be seen the red glare of the smoldering ruins of Tulsa, thousands of homes and businesses. A vast number of whites then in Tulsa and in Oklahoma, I say in 1921, were members of the Ku Klux Klan. They dominated every aspect of Tulsa: law enforcement, city hall, the courts, the newspapers, and businesses. The Grand Wizard of Oklahoma, Washington Ellis Hudson, later became the top-ranking state senator in the legislature that enshrined Jim Crow in Oklahoma law. There was no escaping the wrath and brutality of hatred in every walk of life. The first law of Oklahoma legislature was to segregate blacks from whites in railway transportation. Of note, then, adjacent to the Greenwood District was the Benevolent Association of Tulsa, the KKK's official holding company. At the time it was built, it was Oklahoma's largest venue, the Clavern, or their temple. It was called Beano Hall and reportedly seated 3,000 people. Beano Hall was proudly proclaimed to mean Beano nigger, Beano Jew, Beano Catholic, Beano immigrant. Now, my father would later describe what it meant to live in Tulsa at that time in a city dominated by the KKK. The Ku Klux Klan had issued an ultimatum that blacks be off the streets by 8:30 or 9 o'clock at night. Before then, there was a fine relationship until the Ku Klux Klan became so prominent, dominating, and attempting to do what my father describes as keeping blacks subjugated. Oklahoma was a prosperous, booming oil territory, attracting whites, blacks, and even Asians, and other ethnic groups to the territory. But let it be known then that whites dominated Oklahoma, while Native Americans, tribes occupied large lands in what is called Indian Territory. Whites operated a system of government motivated by anger, hatred, and outrage. They institutionalized also lynch mobs to kill either by hanging, burning, or torturing blacks to enforce the social order that deprived them of political and economic rights and enforced segregation. In addition, Oklahoma had a whipping party in which a large group of whites whipped or beat black people who were suspected of offenses of any kind, even without the required evidence. For example, in 1922 alone, there were 2,500 recorded whippings statewide. According to the Oklahoma Historical Society, our state territory suffered through 6 massacres, blacks out of town. Terrorism by whites occurred in Oklahoma towns of Berwyn in 1895, in Lawton in 1902, and in Boynton in 1904. In 1907, whites in Henrietta burned down the entire black residential district and established a sundowner law. And in Dewey, Oklahoma, in 1917, a similar incident occurred. Tragically, the black people in Oklahoma reached its highest, the massacre of black people in Oklahoma reached its highest point in the Tulsa massacre in 1921. In this climate, my grandparents and children came, suffered, but persevered. Black newspapers in Oklahoma informed black people, chronicling these atrocities. In 1916, my grandfather, whom I called Papa, worked as a business manager for the Tulsa Star, Tulsa's first black newspaper. Today, our mayor's great-grandfather is Joseph A. LaFortune, and as you know, the Notre Dame Student Center is named after him. Our mayor has vowed to unearth for proper burial as many of the 1921 murder victims as possible, and to give them a proper recognition. When asked by a disgruntled constituent why he was unearthing these bodies, the response of the mayor was simple: it's the right thing to do. After 99 years, he is being confronted, criticized, and castigated by some for doing the right thing. Tulsa still suffers from its racism. How else can you explain the existence of one street with 2 names? Only half of the same street honors Dr. Martin Luther King. Why not allow the entire street to honor him? And why is it that there are two state universities standing next to each other, run by the same Board of Regents, one historically Black and the other historically white? I want to talk about my family roots. In 1910, my paternal grandfathers, James Henry Goodwin and Carly Greer Goodwin, moved their 4 children, including my father, Edward, to Tulsa from Jim Crow Water Valley, Mississippi. My grandparents on my father's side, with limited education, my papa had a 4th grade education, and my grandma had an 8th grade education. They found Tulsa's Black community a haven for economic opportunities. They invested in real estate, opened a grocery store, a funeral home business, which he had in Water Valley, helped finance the building of new churches, and worked with Booker T. Washington's local chapter of the National Negro Business League. It was Mr. Washington who is said to have coined the famous idiom, Black Wall Street of America. And as I said earlier, my papa started working at Tulsa's first Black owned newspaper, the Tulsa Star, as its business manager. In 1921, my father never made it to his high school prom. It was scheduled the same night of the massacre. And when the massacre occurred, he and his father and mother and 4 siblings survived the massacre. My family was among hundreds of Tulsans who had sued unsuccessfully the city and insurance companies for destroyed property. They even identified the police captain by name who dropped turpentine bombs down on their houses. Later that year, my father went off to college at Fisk University, earning his undergraduate business degree, and was honored as a Negro All-American football player. There he met my mom, Jean, a Fisk graduate also. My mother would receive a graduate degree and other degrees in St. Louis and Colorado before marrying my dad. He was in business in St. Louis, came back to Tulsa, and like his father, established several businesses, including the purchase of the Oklahoma Eagle in 1936. And then Robert Kerr, later a US Senator, hired my father as director of the state hospital and orphanage with a cruel name. It was called the Taft State Hospital for the Negro Insane. In the meantime, the Greenwood District eventually rebounded from the massacre to become bigger and better than ever. A who's who of some of Black America's most iconic figures made their way to Tulsa, and often to my grandparents' home. And those of you who may not know the name of Count Basie, but Count Basie, the famous jazz orchestra conductor, attributes his musical sound to the music on Greenwood. Since my graduation from Notre Dame, I have pursued a career in the law. I fought to ensure fairness in the criminal justice system, to advocate for civil rights, to improve our access to health care, to desegregate the Tulsa public school system, to co-plaintiff legislative reapportionment so Blacks and Republicans had seats at the table. I co-counseled the case which resulted in changing Tulsa's form of city government so that Blacks would also have a seat at the table. I continue to fight for reparation for victims of the Rice Massacre. In addition to these pursuits, I successfully challenged a state statute and city ordinance that targeted freedom of speech by Black defendants before the US Supreme Court and the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals. Although I'm an advocate of the law, I've also been an advocate for the community. I've spent the past 41 years as publisher of the family's newspaper, the Oklahoma Eagle. Next year, as Tulsa commemorates the Race Massacre after 100 years, the Eagle will also celebrate its 100th year in existence as the 10th oldest Black-owned newspaper in America. We are the only business in Greenwood that has survived the massacre and is still publishing today as an active voice in the community. But for the publisher, though, the Oklahoma Eagle, the Black Wall Street remnants that exist today would not be in existence. As with the law, the newspaper has provided the Black community with continuous, challenging, and undeterred voice to champion the issues that are important and critical for an inclusive and equitable society. Recently, we posed the question to our readers, is Greenwood at the crossroads or in the crosshairs? Over the ensuing years, there have been but token remembrances marking the infamous time. Former promises of appropriate redevelopment have been but sugar-coated deceptions as developers in the city of Tulsa are eyeing the last bits of acreage of land originally taken by the city of Tulsa in trust to provide better opportunities for people indigenous to the area. But the rich and politically well-connected are poised and salivating at the prospects of economic gain. Presently, in some Tulsa boardrooms and offices, individuals are quietly discussing further development plans for the strategic gentrification but legal usurpation of the Greenwood district. The Oklahoma Eagle invites its readers to push a plan to make Greenwood great again and to push back against gentrification. We urge Tulsans to adopt policies which support and embrace the Greenwood district as a world-class destination. Millions of people could visit Tulsa, and particularly Greenwood, because of its unique history on the world stage. Visits by millions make enormous the prospects for small business development, specializing in Greenwood history, food, arts, and entertainment, and perfectly blend in with another commercial arts district adjacent to it. It is only fitting. After the deadly 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, to build on that historic site something other than staying true to its history would have been unthinkable and repugnant. Well, why isn't the same kind of thinking in place concerning Greenwood, where Oklahoma's first domestic terrorist attack took place? As bleak as it may seem, it is not too late to stop at the gate further gentrification. With pride and optimism, all of Tulsa should embrace this endeavor and make Greenwood great again. As a historic place, Tulsa is infamous for its racism and is worthy of further study and reform. But to its defense, so is every other city in the US. Now, if you are serious on learning more about racism, I have a few suggestions that I will recommend as we wind up this session. It's been indeed a pleasure to talk with you, and I look forward to engaging you in further conversation.
Mr. Goodwin, thank you so much for sharing your history and your vision for Tulsa. I'd like to use our remaining time to turn to some questions from our students, if that's all right with you.
Certainly.
Great. Many of our students, including some from Oklahoma, were stunned that they had never heard of the Tulsa massacre prior to this summer. But this was, of course, by design. Tulsa city officials tried to erase the massacre from the city's historical record, going so far as to bury victims in unmarked graves, as you've noted, and selectively expunge newspaper accounts of the violence, even from the microfilm in the libraries. The massacre, as we noted, was certainly not part of school curricula. There are so many untold stories of racial violence in our country. How can we ensure that the Tulsa massacre and other key episodes of racial violence become and remain part of our anti-racist vocabulary, part of our ongoing reckoning with our nation's history?
Well, currently it is now being taught in the Tulsa public school system at the high school level. And there will have to be a continued effort to continue to do that. Explaining that horrific event, I know people cannot, particularly young people today, can't wrap their minds around it. But I think that now that we have it seems to be a new kind of thinking, the truth about what has happened will come forth. I know there's much more to discover about the underbelly of Oklahoma, particularly when the land was acquired illegally by people who And for example, the Glen Pool oil, where oil was discovered, the richest oil find at that time in America, has reportedly have been owned by two freedmen, the last name Manuels. They were at the time in the Muskogee County Jail, never to be heard from, but it was one of the richest oil finds in America. But in answer to your question, I think the continued probing of the records of the Oklahoma Historical Society is moving in that direction. And there's more scholarship to be had. More books are being written about this horrific event. And I think the purpose of it is not to make people feel bad, but to know that racism has seriously affected this country and still afflicts it. And I hope the people who are listening to this program today really reflect upon what it means to be an anti-racist.
In reading reports of the night of the massacre, I was struck by a particular image, which was residents leaving a movie theater, having been indoors as the crowd gathered outside, kind of oblivious to the dangers. And then you mentioned your own father was preparing to go to the prom. And then in the piece you wrote for the Catholic magazine, you talk about the children of Holy Family on stage in their white dresses and suits in the middle of graduation ceremonies. To me, these are the hardest and the most beautiful details that you've shared, these really humanizing anchors of people going about the moments of life, large and small, and then thrust suddenly into tremendous violence and overwhelming loss. And it strikes me that you, as someone who tells stories for a living, both in the paper and in the courtroom.
My apologies.
That's all right. There we go. That you, as someone who tells stories for a living in the paper and in the courtroom, might have thoughts on the power of storytelling for teaching about racial justice.
You're saying that if I understood your question, I'm sorry if that interruption distracted me.
That's all right.
The power of telling stories?
Yes.
Well, I think if I understand your question correctly, the answer is in your question. I mean, we need to personalize, and I think it will make people understand this human condition with these personal stories. And there are many, many personal stories that should be told and are yet to be told. I don't know if I've answered your question, but certainly that's a powerful tool toward getting people to understand the way that people who are who I can't understand their plight.
Some of our students would like you to reflect on the role of the media in Tulsa. So one of the key triggers of the massacre was an inflammatory article, an editorial in the Tulsa Tribune about the allegations against Dick Rowland. But one of the key voices for justice and memory has been your Oklahoma Eagle. You once characterized your role at the Eagle as being a voice crying in the wilderness. So can you talk to us about what the role, the unique role and responsibility in particular of the Black press is, as you see it today?
Well, yes. I mean, it's interesting enough. The Black press is needed more today as it was back then because the metropolitan press, just for its sheer size, I sometimes compare a metropolitan newspaper. I don't want to suggest that they are racist as such, but the news that people read is so broad, and the issues dealing with the homeless, those people who are less fortunate, really don't find their way in the metropolitan newspapers. And so it's kind of like comparing a supermarket with a Quick Trip. I mean, we can mirror those stories that, or reflect on those stories that need to be told. And those stories really reflect experiences that would otherwise not be written about, but they're so important to be told. And the metropolitan papers may not find room, if you will, to tell those human type of stories. And so I think the Black press's role is to continue to fight for the underdog, because surely he and she still exists in our society. I mean, that's our market niche. to be ever vigilant on issues involving human rights, civil rights in the criminal justice system, because those causes are not popular. I know in some metropolitan newspapers, they don't even write editorials anymore because they want to accommodate the status quo. And so a need for publications such as ours and across the country such as ours is most necessary.
So you see your paper as really mission focused.
Yes.
It's beautiful. You mentioned that the mayor is currently getting some pushback for this effort to investigate some potential burial sites, and that the exact number of victims of the massacre has never been known, although there have been oral histories passed down about scores of bodies shoveled into mass graves. This summer, when Tulsa began excavating, what is really the goal at this point? Why now? And what happens if a mass grave is in fact found?
Well, I think as any, you know, you have the tomb of the unknown soldier. I mean, look at the tragedies we've had in war. I mean, giving account. I mean, Black lives do matter, even if they have been sacrificed, and we still need to give them the recognition, their human dignity. I think it's most important to recognize that. I mean, we bury people every day that die, and why ignore the deaths of these people who were murdered? I mean, it's important to resurrect them so that we can look reality in the face. It's important to give the dignity to those people who were not dignified by white folks back then. So I think it's a statement in of itself, and also there are efforts underway even now. Some of the people who were killed have been identified, and they're still ongoing. The records of the Tulsa County Courthouse back then, some have been destroyed, but there are remnants of even those records, I hear, that have identified people who were supposed to be in court, but were written off as being tragedies of the casualties of the riot, of the massacre. I'm sorry. So it seems to me I would answer what the mayor said. It's the right thing to do. We need to give people who were slain their proper due, and it's also gives some solace to the relatives of those victims that they counted in life, and that we want to recognize their existence.
You and I had the opportunity to talk a little bit earlier this week, and in those conversations, it was so clear to me that you are a person of deep faith, and that your faith has been a driving factor in so many of the choices that you've made in your life. And I wonder if you could just talk to us particularly about your advocacy on civil rights and how your faith has been a part of that.
Well, it's interesting. A few years ago at Notre Dame, I gave a short lecture as this one. The title of my presentation was "The Impact of My Faith on My Practice and the Impact of my faith, of my practice on my faith." And during that presentation, I divided my life into two areas. The first 25 years, I spent plenty of time bending my elbow. It was a stick figure I showed in this presentation of a person bending the elbow with a glass of wine and a cigarette in hand, which was typical my protocol back then. And then the second 25 years, at about the age 50, I began seeing the importance of going back to my training, of bending my knees. And I think that in that transition, those things that you ignore in your younger lives become so important in your more mature lives. And so, in fact, the Oklahoma Eagle has gone through 2 bankruptcies and Chapter 11s. And during that course of time, I've written about our struggles, but I've always undergirded with faith. In fact, I have on my hallway a series of editorials in which I publicly discuss our plight, and it's called The Wall of Faith. The faith is so important in our existence in this world today, and it has been a tool that I've used in my practice. I have clients who have come to me most concerned and most worried, and I've been given a word to help them disarm and really arrest fear that so often plagues them. I found that that's important because when you're interviewing a client, you really can't get at the truth if they have in their brain this fear, what I call static. You have to expunge their minds, if you will. I have them expunge their minds of fear. And once that's done, and that can only be done when they recognize that they don't have the answers and that they must place faith in someone else, and generally in God. And I can give a demonstration, but we don't have the time now, that would assure people who are uncertain about the circumstances will walk out of my office confident, not in the prediction of the future, but they have a faith. We try to look at a faith like Job said, even though you slay me, I will trust in thee. That's a statement that it takes some time to deliberate on, and to study. But it's that kind of a faith that allows me to meet these challenges that we have in the newspaper and in the law practice. I don't know if I've answered your question, but my mind took me there.
I think you have. That was beautiful. Thank you. One of our students noted that in some of your recent interviews, you've expressed concern about racism visibly creeping into American life. And the student's question was whether you think racism is really on the rise, or instead that there's greater acknowledgement of the racism that existed at the time of the massacre and continues perhaps in a different form today.
I think the answer is both. I think it's very obvious that what's going on in our country today. The one thing about, as I indicated in the video, the one significant thing about George Floyd's death, there was an outcry worldwide. And as I indicated in the video, his death signaled the acceptance of people, the humanity in people. People didn't look at George Floyd because he's Black. They saw his humanity and recoiled against the inhumanity that caused his death. That's a good sign. And, when man intends for evil, God intends for good. And I think that there is an awareness, particularly in the younger generation. And I think there's a movement toward anti-racism. But if you would ask someone to define racism, you'll get many different answers. But I think, I was having a discussion with my son. He said, Dad, why are you, I asked him, I said, I wonder when racism became a source of academic interest. And he said, Dad, we don't need to learn about it. It happens, we experience racism every day. I said, it seems to be something that white folks need to learn more about. But then again, I take a pregnant pause here and say that I think racism should be studied both by Black and white Americans. And I think its study is worthy to be explored by the academics.
You mentioned the killing of George Floyd as kind of a catalyst. And last week, our speaker talked to us about not having a huge amount of hope because the struggle has been too long and the progress toward equality and equity too meager. Do you feel hopeful in this moment, either for the nation or specifically for Tulsa?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Can you repeat that question, please?
Sure. Our speaker last week mentioned to us that she didn't have much hope because the struggle for equality and equity has been too long and the progress too small. Do you feel hopeful in this moment? And do you feel hopeful both for our nation and for your own community of Tulsa?
Yes, you have to have hope. I mean, the opposite of hope is worry, and we must be hopeful. And without it, we might as well give up. Yes, the challenges are great. Yes, the challenges still today are horrific. But I believe firmly that people who actively, as Father Hesburgh said, who actively seek out to rid this country and root its racist views away from the public square and their private lives, I think that can be done. And I think young people, particularly as America gets more blended, young people see the wrongness of behavior. And so I'm very hopeful. It's not going to be done without a struggle. That's why people like our newspaper and myself, there are thousands of us out there working in the vineyards against these evils. We must continue the struggle and never give up hope.
That's a beautiful image. Thousands working in the vineyards. Next year, as we've mentioned, is the centennial of the Tulsa massacre. In your ideal world, how would our nation and again, your own community recognize the anniversary?
Well, in a myriad of ways. The plans are, even being as we speak now, there'll be celebratory. Is it the massacre or the June 19th? I'm sorry. Which was your subject matter again?
Well, we were talking. It will be the 100th anniversary of the massacre this coming year.
Yeah. Well, you know, a lot of anti-racist programs. It's a fitting time for that to occur. It's a fitting time for people, black and white, and all other hues, to come together to enjoy one another and to, the celebration. It's a time for the celebration of diversity. I mean, the music and the creativity that has been rendered by Black Americans over the centuries should be explored. I mean, I guess what I say here is that we show plenty of evidence of the important contributions that Black Oklahomans and United States citizens who are Black have made to this culture. I mean, that's the best way to, in my opinion, to contrast the evils of the massacre with the evident genius, if you will, or talent, or of Black folks. I mean, I think that's the best way to do it.
Thank you. Our hope at the Clow Center is that today is not for our viewers just a one-time event to watch, but an invitation to engage more with the legacy of the historic events we've talked about today. With each of our speakers this year, we're building a list of recommended resources for further study, and I know you have some ready for us. So I'd like to close by asking you for yours, some must-reads or must-sees or must-listens for those who are inspired.
Well, as you know, the YouTube is replete with historical accounts of the massacre, and so your viewers need just go to Google and Google the events about Greenwood. It's replete. But also on YouTube are great lectures by Cornel West and Mike Eric Dyson and Gregory Robinson and Robin DiAngelo. There are books written by Scott Ellsworth, Death in a Promised Land, Danielle Davis, who wrote Untangling the Red, White, and Black Heritage, Hannibal Johnson's Black Wall Street, Tom Madigan's The Burning, and Randy, our own Tulsa, Randy Kriebel, who wrote Tulsa 1921, Reporting the Massacre. There are so many other sources to refer you to, but those are certain you get a good understanding of this whole issue of racism in America, its pernicious impact. It doesn't do us well. We must rid ourselves, but I'm afraid it's going to be a lifelong, every generation process. And hopefully, the more we talk about it, the more we analyze it, hopefully the better people will fight against it and understand the importance of being anti-racist.
I know you were hopeful that we'd be able to share some music today. I wonder if you might tell our audience what you'd like them to listen to.
Well, there's a famous song by Count Basie. I thought it would be a fitting way to introduce me. Count Basie, Every Day I Have the Blues. Because I mentioned Count Basie because it was on the streets of Greenwood that he got his musical sound. Not only did Count Basie fashion his sound after Greenwood, but Duke Ellington also took some musical players from this area. The talent emanating from Greenwood is just replete, but I thought that would be a happy way, a stirring way, when Count Basie played his instrumental orchestra. Every day I have the blues. It's a marvelous rendering. Go to YouTube, listen to it. I understood we would have some copyright problems if I played it as an introduction to this lecture.
Mr. Goodwin, on behalf of the Clow Center and the University of Notre Dame, thank you for being here. We are so grateful for your life's work, your tremendous faith, and your great affection for your alma mater.